Good afternoon. Mr. Luckman and I welcome you to another discussion of the great ideas. This afternoon, we conclude the discussion of labor by considering the problem of liberal education in relation to labor and leisure. Last week's discussion of the Industrial Revolution in its effects upon the organization of labor and the distribution of leisure prepares for our consideration of education this afternoon. Let me remind you of the main conclusions we reached. We saw the great advantages that accrued to men and to societies from the Industrial Revolution that took place largely in the last 100 years. We saw how in the industrial mode of production broke down, almost abolished, the sharp distinction between a working class and a leisure class. We saw the effect it had on establishing for the first time the dignity of all forms of labor. And we saw the political effect, how as men became emancipated from grinding toil and had the leisure to do so, there was some sense in giving them the rights of suffrage and the duties of citizenship. But we also saw last time two great evil consequences of the Industrial Revolution. We saw how as free time increased, men tended to misuse this free time by using it for recreation or play instead of for genuinely leisure activities. And we also, at least, faced the statement that I made last time, that with these changes, there was a progressive deterioration in liberal education. Mr. Luckman challenged that last statement of mine by pointing to the obvious facts that in the last 50 years, with the rapidly increasing Industrial Revolution, education was on the increase. It seemed to be improving, not deteriorating. Let's look at the facts for a moment so that I can once more make a comment on Mr. Luckman's point. The statistics I read last week were, of course, entirely from the United States. They apply only to a very advanced industrial country, not to the backward portions of the world. So today my statistics come from American facts and figures. In 1900, there were less than 10% of the children between the ages of 14 and 17 in high school, whereas in 1950, there were more than 70% of that age group in high school. At the time of World War I, 75% or more of the draftees had had 8 years or less than 8 years of schooling, whereas at the time of World War II, 20 years later, 68% of the draftees had had 9 years of schooling or more, and 39% had had 12 years of schooling or more, as compared with only 9.5% 20 years earlier. In the first 50 years of this century, the number of teachers and the number of schools doubled and redoubled many times, and with this, of course, the appropriations to cover the cost of education. Now, Lloyd, it seems to me that what these facts show is that schooling has been on the increase. But if you look at the facts, it's clear that this is a quantitative improvement, not a qualitative improvement. If we ask ourselves, what about the quality of education in the last 50 years? Has that improved? It seems to me there, Lloyd, the sad fact is that as schooling has increased more and more, education has deteriorated, for it has become less and less liberal. And if we put the emphasis upon the word liberal, then we understand, I think, the point about the deterioration of education in the last 50 years. Now that brings us to the main point of this afternoon's discussion, and I think we can start, Lloyd, with two questions we received. One from Miss Cavanaugh, I think, and one from Mr. Starkey.
Yes, that's right. Here's the one from Mrs. Cavanaugh. She's a resident of Livermore. She says, since so many connotations attach themselves to the term liberal, will you please preface your discussion with an explanation of the term as applied to education?
I certainly am glad that you restricted her question, glad you restricted your question, Miss Kavanaugh, to liberal as applied to education. For to define a liberal in the political sense as a name for one of the great parties or positions, contrasted with the conservative position or the radical position, is very difficult indeed. You probably have heard the definition of the liberal that is given either by the conservative or by the radical who doesn't like the liberal. He says the liberal is a man with both feet squarely planted in midair. But to explain what liberal means as applied to education is not so difficult. In fact, one catches the meaning immediately that one recognizes that the word liberal has the same root that the word liberty has, and that root means, in Latin, free. And so, you can define liberal education by saying it is education for free men, it is the education of free men, and for their use of freedom. The freedom they have to use because they belong to the ruling class in society and because they belong to the leisure class in society. I think that is a perfectly clear definition of what liberal means as applied to education.
Well, now with that in mind, then, we can go on to this second question, which follows quite hard on Miss Kavanaugh's question, Dr. Adler. And I think it may be harder for you to answer it so briefly. It comes from Mr. Elmer Starkey of Petaluma. Very short and sweet. He says, just what does a liberal education consist in? Now, that's all Mr. Starkey wants to know.
That question, Mr. Starkey, calls for a book, not a sentence or two. And because it calls for a book, I'm going to recommend some books which you and others may be interested to read on the subject of what liberal education consists in. I have here a long list of books about liberal education from the 5th century BC down to our own day. I'm only going to recommend 4, written by Americans, 3 Americans, that I think are excellent on the subject. One is the book by John Dewey, the great book at the beginning of the century, Democracy and Education, published in 1916. And then a book by Mark Van Doren in 1943 called simply Liberal Education. And then 2 books by my friend Robert M. Hutchins, one in 1943 called Education for Freedom, and one published only last year called The Conflict in Education. Now, that doesn't answer your question, Mr. Starkey, but let me see if I can, in 2 sentences, this will be brief and inadequate, but let me try in 2 sentences to say what liberal education consists in. I would say, first, in school, liberal education consists in acquiring the disciplines of learning how to learn, and then in becoming acquainted for the first time with the ideas that one must spend a lifetime in trying to understand. And I would say, second, that in adult life, liberal education consists in using the liberal arts, which are the disciplines of learning, the disciplines acquired in school, to carry on the process of learning in the lifelong pursuit of understanding, insight, and wisdom. Now, with these 2 questions answered, Lloyd, I think I can state my 2 main propositions, the ones I should like to explain and perhaps even defend against objection. My 2 main propositions are, first, that the universal distribution of leisure and suffrage that accompanies industrialization requires an industrial democracy to give liberal schooling to all the children who are going to grow into free men and women, free in the sense of having leisure time, free in the sense of being citizens. And my second proposition is that because the purpose of this liberal schooling is prepare these children for the use of the leisure they will have when they grow up, and because leisure itself, one of its main uses, is to continue learning, my second proposition is that liberal learning must continue throughout an adult life as one of the main uses of leisure. Now, I think that these 2 things are requirements of an industrial democracy will be clear to anyone who keeps before him the understanding of labor and leisure as we've been discussing these basic terms for the last 4 weeks. But to be sure that this is clear, because I think it makes a great deal of difference to have these two propositions as clear and more than clear, seen to be true, as they possibly made to be seen to be true. I would like to give you a graphic demonstration of their truth. I have a series of charts which my son Mark made for me that I think clearly make this proposition quite clear. The first chart considers the character of education in all the pre-industrial aristocracies of the past. Let's look at it together. In all the pre-industrial aristocracies of the past, education was only for the few, that few being a leisure class and a ruling class. And that education for the few of free men, consisted of liberal schooling and adult liberal learning. There was no education for the many at all. There was no need to educate disfranchised slaves and workers. They had no freedom. They had no leisure. They were not citizens. They needed no education. All that they received was training on the job. And of course, there was no learning, no time for learning in their adult life. Now, I want to stress three things in this chart. I want to stress the fact that in all the pre-industrial aristocracies of the past, education was liberal education. One didn't talk about some education being liberal and some being vocational. Education was liberal education. One didn't talk of vocational training as education at all. It was the training of workers or slaves. And when one conceived education itself as essentially liberal, one saw that it could not be accomplished in school, that it could only be begun in school, that the main points and purposes of liberal education had to be fully accomplished in adult life. Now then think of what the principles are that are shown in this chart. That education is liberal when it is for the free, and its purpose for the free is enable them to use their leisure well and to perform their duties as members of a ruling class. If one understands the principles of that chart, and I think the principles of that chart are clear then, one can imagine what education should be like in an industrial democracy. What should we expect of education in an industrial democracy? Well, my second chart indicates what we should expect of education in an industrial democracy. In an industrial democracy in which all men are citizens, and as citizens, members of the ruling class, they are citizen rulers, and in which they are all not merely workers, but free workers, workers with the dignity of labor, and therefore with leisure. In such a society, one would expect that there be liberal schooling for all, and there be opportunities and provisions for liberal learning in adult life for all. And that follows like the night the day. For if the principles of the first chart were true and clear, this is the way that we applied to an industrial democracy in which the main shift is from the few who are free to all men who are free as men with leisure and as citizens. But is this the situation in America today, the most advanced industrial democracy in the world? Does this chart describe what education is like in America today? I'm sorry to say the answer to that question is no. What we find instead is this. We find that in the United States of America, in the first half of the 20th century, between 1900 and 1950, what we have achieved is approximately 8 years of common schooling, ordinary elementary schooling for all children, which by itself is, I think, woefully insufficient as preparation for citizenship and leisure. And past the 8th grade, we divide our children. We give liberal schooling, and I'm sorry to say it isn't too good at that, but liberal schooling for a minority in the liberal arts high schools and colleges, many of which are not liberal enough. But for the majority, for most of the children, after they leave elementary school, we give them vocational training in school instead of on the job. And we certainly have, I think, clearly inadequate provisions for the liberal education for adults in the country where most adults have an enormous amount of leisure. Now, this chart shows how American education in the first half of the 20th century, in which the Industrial Revolution has matured and given us the opportunities we have not used, how American education fails, in reality, to conform to the ideal that you saw on the chart just preceding. I think one can understand why that failure took place. The problem of giving liberal education to all the children, which is required in an industrial democracy, is a very difficult problem. Much more difficult than any problem that educators have ever faced in the history of mankind. And that problem hit American education with a suddenness for which they were unprepared, so that they hardly saw the problem as it overtook them and in some sense swamped them. This, I think, excuses American educators for the first 25 or 30 years of the century from not doing what should have been done. But what is inexcusable, in my judgment, is the fact that now, 50 years after the turn of the century, American educators are still not facing the problem. They are still permitting this division between liberal schooling for the few and vocational training for the many to be prevalent, widely prevalent in our school system. They are still not facing the problem. They are running away from it when in fact this problem cannot be solved unless it's faced and dwelt upon. I do not mean to imply that I know the solution to the problem. In fact, I would say there is no American educator who at the moment knows how to solve this problem. All that can be said is what is required for its solution. We must somehow discover by hard thought and patient effort, the ways and means of giving all the children the same kind of education, the liberal education that was given to the select few in all the pre-industrial aristocracies of the past.
Dr. Adler.
Yes, Lloyd.
I agree with you about the problem we must solve, and also what's required to solve it. But I know a very great many educators and many teachers, too, who wouldn't agree with you. And I'm just wondering how you would answer their objection.
What is their objection? They only have one objection, Lloyd?
No, I'm sure that you know very well that they have many objections. But there is one that goes to the very heart of this particular matter. It's simply that the facts, again, are against you. Now, here we have this problem, that most of the children, or at least half of them, just haven't the capability of profiting by a liberal education. And therefore, we're faced with the choice of providing vocational training for those children who do not profit by the liberal education.
Lloyd, I think that is a basic misstatement. The people who say that are misunderstanding the democratic maxim of equal educational opportunity. They think the maxim is correctly stated when they say we give equal educational opportunity to all the children because we give them equal amounts of schooling. That is an incorrect understanding of the maxim, I think. The correct interpretation of that maxim is that equal educational opportunity means the opportunity for all the children not merely to have the same amount of schooling, but to enjoy receiving the same kind or quality of schooling. And that quality must be liberal. And I say, Lloyd, that all the facts, which I'm willing to admit, certainly must admit, all the facts of individual differences do not change in one bit, in one particular, the principle I've just stated. Let me show you that. Let me show you that. I have here two containers. Two containers. Here is a quart container. Here is a pint container. Let the quart container represent the quart-sized child, the child with a quart-sized capacity for receiving liberal education. Let the pint container represent the pint-sized child, the child with a pint-sized capacity for receiving liberal education. Now, what does the democratic maxim of equal educational opportunity for all the children mean? Does it mean putting merely the quantity of liquid these two containers can receive into them, putting cream into the large container and milk or skim milk or water, worse, water, into the small container? For as compared with education, vocational training is mere water. No, it does not mean that. What we are required to do with these two unequal containers representing the unequal gifts of natural endowment is to put the same kind of liquid in both. A quart of cream, if we can manufacture the cream of education, a quart of cream into the quart container and a pint of cream into the pint container. That is treating the two children equally. Now, I say that American education today is as wrong in principle as Thomas Jefferson was in 1817, as undemocratic in principle as Thomas Jefferson was in 1817 when he proposed to the Virginia legislature a bill to give all the children of Virginia 3 years of common schooling up to, no more than that. And then beyond the third year, he suggested dividing them into those who were destined for labor. They would be sent out of school to the farms, to the shops as apprentices. And those destined for leisure and for politics, they would go on to college. Are we much better than that today? Yes. In one sense, we are. We give 8 years of common schooling. But that merely is the result of the Industrial Revolution. We give 8 years of common schooling, but after that, we divide the children just as Thomas Jefferson would have us divide them into those destined for labor and those destined for leisure and for rule. Whereas, in fact, they're all destined for leisure and for political life. The ideal we must face is to give all the children not merely 8 years of common schooling, but adequate liberal training, liberal schooling through high school, and I would go further and say through college. All the children up to and through a Bachelor of Arts degree, which is the training, the education they should receive in preparation for their role in the life of freedom, the use of their own leisure, and the performance of their political duties. Now, I have to face the facts. If that ideal cannot be realized, then we ought to give democracy up, give it up entirely, and return to the aristocratic forms of society in which the free were separated from the slaves. The men with leisure and the ruling classes were separated from the disfranchised many who were slaves or workers. Because I say to you, to give suffrage and leisure to those who are incapable of liberal education is dangerous to society and dangerous to the men themselves who have this leisure and are not educated to use it. I don't think that's the case. I think all men can receive liberal education. But if they can't, then we ought to give democracy up.
Well, Dr. Adler, again, let's suppose that this ideal that you're stating can be realized, however far off that realization might be. But there's still another difficult problem to solve here, and it's in a question that I have. It's about the relationship of liberal education to labor this time, not to leisure.
I'm glad we make that shift, as a matter of fact, Lloyd.
Mr. Nelson, I think, points it out very well, Dr. Adler, when he asks you if everyone is liberally educated. He says, what are we going to do about the menial and disagreeable tasks that no one with a liberal education would then want to work at?
Lloyd, I think that the question is an very good one. Mr. Nelson asked a question that is always asked. I've talked to many audiences about liberal education over the years, and it is interesting how, when you propose the possibility, the ideal that all the children will go to college someday, that they all will get a liberal schooling in which there's no vocational training whatsoever, they'll all be prepared for a life of leisure and of citizenship. Someone in the audience always asks the question, Mr. Nelson, and what are you going to do then about the lower tasks, the less pleasant tasks, the more menial tasks in the hierarchy of tasks that constitutes the division of labor in a complex industrial society? Now, there's one answer to the question. I think, in fact, there are two. But let me give you the first answer. It's suggested to us, Lloyd, by one of our correspondents, Mr. Edward C. Keachie, who I think teaches industrial engineering.
Yes, he is an industrial.
At Berkeley,
Yeah.
University of California. And Mr. Keachie, in this letter, suggests that the automatic or push-button factory of the future will do away with a great many repetitive manual jobs, and so eliminate a great deal of drudgery from the labor men have to do. But that's only part of the answer, Mr. Nelson. The other part is that the scale of individual differences will remain unchanged after all individuals are liberally educated up to their capacity, the quart-size capacity or the pint-size capacity. So there always will be human inequality, and that human inequality will somehow always fit the hierarchy of tasks, even when many menial tasks have been removed by the push-button factory and labor has been liberalized and all workers are liberally educated. I don't think there's any problem about the fitting of men into the complex hierarchy of tasks that a society requires. Lloyd, I think we have time for one more question.
Very well. Mr. Asturias of Oakland, California, wants you to tell him whether women should have the same sort of liberal education as men in our industrial age.
Mr. Asturias, that again is a question I think very good. It's familiar. It's a question that's asked again and again, is it not? One thing we should face at once. Are women citizens? Do women have leisure? Even when they work? Even when they have housework to do? Or when they're office workers? If they are citizens, and if they have leisure, then they need liberal education just as much as men do. But I always like to say one more thing here. If women don't work, and I suppose, Lloyd, there are some women who don't work, either housework or any other kind of work, they have more leisure than any man in an industrial society has, and therefore women who don't work need liberal education even more than men do. For liberal education is an indispensable condition of their being saved from the misuse of their free time and their having the ways of using it well. This ends our discussion of labor. Next week, we're going to start a new idea. And that idea, I hope you'll be interested in, is the idea of philosophy itself. That will be our subject throughout February. We're going to consider what philosophy is and what use it is. We're going to consider the philosopher, what he does and how he does it. As in the case of labor, we were concerned with the relation of labor to leisure and play. So here in philosophy, we're going to be concerned with it in itself and in relation to science and religion. I hope you will send questions in concerning philosophy so that we can answer them as we go on with the discussion of philosophy throughout the month of February. Good afternoon.